In today's video from Demystifying Proposals, we're going to talk about proposal repositories, the repositories to put in place to make the proposal development process a little easier. These are the repositories every proposal operations team should have: a submitted proposal repository, best reuse repository, RFI repository, graphics repository, resume repository, past performance repository, Kudos repository. We're going to talk about each one of those repositories. Some of them are more optional than others. The submitted proposals repository is meant to preserve the artifacts that were originally submitted and the RFPs against which those artifacts were built. After submission, the proposal manager should copy the final submitted files for all volumes to this repository. Be sure to copy and not move those files. The proposal manager should also copy all of the RFP files and the amendments of the RFP. This repository then serves as the library of what was submitted should the government ask questions. It also saves a copy of the files in a different place than the SharePoint or whatever system you happen to use that was used originally. That's because people will go into the SharePoint and they may accidentally change the final versions of the proposal files when working on future proposals. So you want to make sure that you have a repository that has those pristine files. Because it includes the cost volume and the attendance spreadsheets and other cost-related information, access to the submitted proposals repository is usually very limited. Usually only contracts, pricing, and BD leadership have access, in addition to the proposal operations team. The next repository is the best reuse repository. We call it the best reuse repository. Other companies call it different things, but basically it's a place for where you can find content for reuse. The proposal manager after submission should break down each proposal submission into content for reuse. We recommend breaking down all proposals, not just winning proposals, as winning is often dependent on things other than the quality of the content. Obviously, if a debrief mentions a section as non-compliant, that section's inclusion in the best reuse repository should be rethought. Usually, this repository is further broken down or tagged in more sophisticated repositories by topic, such as technical, management, or possibly further refined from there. Access is meant to be broad, so generally all staff have access to the reuse repository. If you don't already have them, developing standard sections for frequent reuse can be handy. These may not have been submitted as a whole because of page count, but should be complete in the repository. Examples of this might be program management, including standard methodologies and how they're actually implemented in your company. Consider having more than one of these depending on the contract type, as noted in our video, Writing Based on Contract Type. Risk management is another example of a standard section you might want to develop. Transition in, transition out, and others depending on your company. Resumes and past performance citations usually go in their own repositories. And also be sure to align these sections with your company's program management templates. Usually most companies have templates that program managers can use for the submissions for the government, and you want to make sure that you're aligning your reuse repository information with how the company manages programs. Developing standard content for technical solutions that your company can deliver off the shelf can also be helpful. These might include things like artificial intelligence, agile management, other solutions as appropriate. Again, the idea is not to restrict the page count on these, but to give the writers the breadth of information that they can then refine for a particular proposal. Next, we recommend an RFI repository. Responses to requests for information, sources sought notices, and other government market research should be held in a centralized repository. In some companies, these responses are not managed by proposal operations. However, they should be a goldmine of content for the proposals that follow those market research opportunities, or just general content on topics typical for the company. In our experience, these responses sometimes live, if you want to call it that, on individual systems and not in a centralized place. And if that's the case, someone, often the proposal operations director, may periodically have to ask the BD leads, account managers, and capture managers to post them to this centralized RFI repository. We do not necessarily advocate for proposal operations to manage these responses. It depends on the size of your company and how you want to manage them. That's up to individual companies. However, we believe that RFI responses should be reviewed by someone. Who has access to this repository is also a company-specific decision. Having a centralized reuse repository for graphics is the ideal. Again, these graphics should be tagged as to topic and or put in directories based on topic, depending on how sophisticated your repositories are. The proposal manager is responsible for copying final graphics from the proposal into the master graphics repository after the proposal has been submitted. If there are graphics that didn't make it into the final, but may be good for reuse, consider copying those as well. Generally, the repository is the JPEG versions, not the originals used by the graphic artists. That's because these graphics are meant to inspire, but not necessarily be edited by authors who may or may not have graphic software. And it also may not remember to do a save as before making changes. So we want to make sure that the originals of these graphics exist somewhere else that folks don't have access to it. This repository should be available to all staff, so it is available to any author at any time. Resume repositories can be tricky to implement. Are they meant to be for the staff, particularly hiring managers to look at when they're looking for new staff? Are they meant for proposal operations purposes? In most companies, there are 2 resume repositories, one for each of these audiences. However, it may be beneficial to combine them. Resumes submitted with proposals should be updated in this repository. However, we believe it is a best practice to have multiple copies of resumes because each resume is usually tailored for an RFP. So don't replace the existing resume. Instead, create a folder for each staff member and post those resumes from the proposals in that folder. The challenge comes from keeping resumes up to date. In most companies, updating your resume annually is required, and HR usually is the one who handles this. In a perfect world, that update would also be applied to the resume the next time it's used for a proposal. Proposal operations would handle that. So you can see that it's important to figure out whether having 1 or 2 repositories is in the company's best interest. Some of these same issues apply to any past performance repository. Previous past performances from proposals should be maintained in a centralized repository. However, most companies also maintain a repository of program descriptions for use in all kinds of things like marketing and RFI responses. And the information in the past performance needs to be updated before being used in the next proposal. So, as with the resume repository, each company needs to struggle through with the best way to keep past performances current. At a minimum, all contract information, the points of contact, the total contract value, even the contract number, should be updated before use in a proposal and updated in the repository if necessary. And as with resumes, it is often useful to have several drafts of each past performance with different angles for different types of proposals. Again, a best practice may be to have a folder for each program with multiple versions of the past performance citations within that folder. And this may include those developed for the program and marketing, etc., as well as those used on proposals. Some companies maintain a repository of kudos received from customers. This might be awards that your program or your staff may have received from your customer. It usually includes the contractor performance assessment reports or the CPARs. It can include customer satisfaction survey information if your company does customer satisfaction surveys, etc., things like that. However, maintaining and keeping such a repository up to date is often challenging. So consider instead having a file in the past performance repository within each program's folder for Kudos. And be sure to confirm all kudos before using them. Make sure that they're still viable from the government's perspective. Things change on programs, and what happened at a point in time may not still hold. We hope you enjoyed this video from Demystifying Proposals. As always, click on like to tell us you like the video and click on the bell to subscribe. Thank you.